I'm really excited about our upcoming concert, January 11th. On the program, we have this absolute schizophrenic mix of Dvorak, Frank Zappa, and Philip Glass. Why? Well, here it is why. Dvorak was a European composer who wrote in the style of the Romantic school, Slavonic inspired. Brahms supported him. The 8th symphony that we're going to perform starts in G minor. So this beautiful, lush, romantic sound. Now, Dvorak moved to the United States in 1892 to teach at the American Conservatory in New York City. Taught there for 3 years, and his mission was, his vision was to teach not the European style of composition, but to really bring out in his students their individual voice, their ethnic voice. He taught lots of African Americans and actually had female composers at that time, which was a huge deal. Now, my whole idea is that American composers developed in a very different direction than the Europeans over the next 100 years. And Frank Zappa and Philip Glass are the outcome of that philosophy of Dvorak's 100 years earlier, to compose what's in one's heart and not what one is supposed to compose because of a certain school. So the first piece on the concert of our January 11th evening is Frank Zappa, Dog Breath Variations. And first of all, Frank Zappa has a direct connection with Frankfurt, with my hometown, because that his last recording was made in Frankfurt with the Ensemble Modern, playing his Uncle Meat after the Yellow Shark recording, and was arranged for contemporary ensemble with that ensemble that is in my hometown. And there was always this understanding or this knowledge of me, kind of, wow, there was this connection with Frank Zappa in Frankfurt. Made me very proud. Now, Frank Zappa was born in 1940 and moved a lot in his childhood because of his dad's work, and lived in San Diego actually for a while, California. Went to high school in San Diego. The music that we're going to perform is from an experimental movie, Uncle Meat. And actually on YouTube one can listen parts of the soundtrack. There is not visuals, but the soundtrack is it's nuts. From 1968, 67, 68, America. It was very interesting times, of course. And he talks about the background story a little to the film and the music to make people wake up. That was one of his big things, to make people wake up and to think. And the music he used on that record was all over the place, from classical to organ to flute to rock and roll to R&B. He really used experimental jazz, and it was that scope that he actually brought to the table, and that then became a little bit his legacy. So here, I will play a little bit his music. So the whole thing is, it's jazz. I mean, you have this kind of groove, and then he kind of improvises, and it's written out, but it's free. It was in a way part of free jazz. Harmonies that are not your regular major minor key. So he uses the fifth here and then adds another second in it. So now the version that we are going to perform then with orchestra features the full orchestra, reduced strings, lots of percussion, but then for me the fun part is there's lots of marimba and so where he elevates the percussion instruments and where the melodies are not in your regular strings, where the melody is played by percussion instruments that in the 20th century really became their own voice, and becomes quite a fun and exotic and powerful opener. Now, Philip Glass is the second piece on the program, Philip Glass's Violin Concerto, and his Violin Concerto is really the piece that made him more famous, I guess, or more mainstream at that time. It was composed in 1987, and he always had this very special relationship to Dennis Russell Davies, conductor, who absolutely championed his works. Dennis Russell Davies is the music director of the Bruckner Orchestra in Linz in Austria, and it's also a very interesting combination between this Austrian composer Bruckner and Philip Glass, very contemporary, of course. Now, the Violin Concerto is 3 movements. It was written for Zukovsky, a violin soloist at that time, and doesn't have specific titles. I mean, it's mostly like metronome markings, 150, 120, and 150 again for the first, second, and third movement. But the whole idea is really that it's minimal music. Minimal meaning that one idea kind of is the godfather of that type of composition. Now, I was really lucky to have met him, not just like a day. He was in Winnipeg for 3 days and played himself and performed piano, and we did a world premiere of his 8th string quartet at that time, and I performed his 12th symphony. And was a really exciting, actually, endeavor, the whole thing. Now, the most personal that he told me or us was how difficult it was for him in the 60s, in the 70s, to actually have a career. And the reason was that nobody cared about that type of composition. Nobody knew about it, and everybody has more that type of European, either romantic music making or that contemporary school where it was more all over the place. And he was considered a dilettante. And he said that even like 20 years ago, 15 years ago, when he was performed by the Boston Symphony Orchestra, the players were laughing behind his back. And it was always extremely hurtful. And it was Philip Glass. I mean, somebody, for me, who is like the most well-known, I guess, composer of his time, of our time, had to struggle so hard with being recognized, with being a valid composer. Now, the other interesting thing is that if one listens nowadays to any film music, TV series, from Game of Thrones, House of Cards, you name it, it's all minimalism. It all was inspired by that type of music from the 60s, from Philip Glass, and in this case also Steve Reich, of course, and who were the front runners, and completely shifted how composers wrote music. Now, the soloist of the Violin Concerto is Jennifer Koh, and she has a very special relationship with Philip Glass because she is the one who plays the extensive violin part. This is like an hour long or over an hour long in his biggest opera, in Philip Glass's biggest opera, Einstein on the Beach, which in itself is 6 hours long. It's always like a multi-million-dollar production. Every time it's put on stage is sold out. It's a huge event. And she was the one in San Francisco when it was done there. And she's standing on the stage, playing by heart, everything memorized, and is really a front runner of interpretation of Philip Glass's music. That's why I picked Jennifer Koh. So it's a real treat to have her come again actually to Oklahoma City. All right, the cornerstone of this whole evening is Dvorak's 8th Symphony. I guess everybody knows Dvorak. Antonín Dvorak, Czech composer, and mostly known of his, well, the most famous pieces are the Cello Concerto and his 9th Symphony from the New World, which he did write in America. Now, he wrote 9 symphonies, and this is the 8th Symphony. He grew up in Bohemia and was always, as a talented young student, musician, and composer. His breakthrough really came when he did a competition where Brahms was part of the jury, and Johannes Brahms, the German composer, was absolutely in awe of this young fellow composing in the style of his country, Slavonic dances, Slavonic music, and he really supported him and supported his career. Now the music here, first movement, the 4 movements, each one is utterly romantic, of course, and beautiful. He starts the first movement with the cello. He loved the cello. A little later, he, of course, I mentioned it, wrote the Cello Concerto, most famous cello concerto ever written. So this is how it starts. G minor. That's the first theme. So one feels right away kind of hugged, right? It's like a hug. And then from the dark string sound, he moves up to the flute. It's very simple. G major, so he moves from G minor to G major, and you suddenly have this ethereal bird sound in the flute. Just one instrument. So really you have the dark colors and the bright, beautiful flute color as a contrast. Then he builds this to a little climax and comes to the second theme, which is again rooted in the violas and the cello in warm wooden colors. Here you have G major, D minor, a D major, and C major. Develops it again. So you can see what rich culture and what rich colors there are that he uses. And then really moves, so the whole movement. He has a third theme, bouncing back and forth between strings, flute, strings. Now again, flute and oboe in a minor. And again moves on, and you have, I don't know what it is, it's not really a Slavonic melody, but it is. So he was one of those composers who completely internalized it, and it doesn't sound English, whatever, or French. It's not Impressionism, you know. It was 1888, where in France it was already Impressionist music. Not at all. you really have this beautiful Slavonic, bohemian, romantic music. I'm really excited about our upcoming concert, January 11th at the Civic Center. It features Dvorak, Frank Zappa, and Philip Glass. Again, one of my favorite evenings of the whole season. I hope to see you all for this extremes of music on the stage with the Oklahoma City Philharmonic.